Welcome back to the next section of Visual Studio Code and Docker training. In this section, we're going to talk about how to connect to Docker hosts using Visual Studio Code's Docker extension. And it's a feature built within Docker. It's called Docker Context. And Docker Context allows you to define different Docker hosts. For example, in the cloud or a virtual machine or wherever you like. Or you can actually spawn out another container with Docker running inside, which we'll do in the lab later. And you can connect to this container and run totally separate workloads. So what does it look like within the UI? If you switch to other Docker hosts, you'll see within the Docker UI, at the very bottom, you'll see context. And you see these three different contexts. You'll have a default context, which is your normal Docker desktop. And I also created a couple of different contexts in this example. You see Brian's Docker. That's an example server I have running in the cloud. And then Docker in Docker. And Docker in Docker is essentially a Docker container that's running with Docker inside of it, and you can actually run containers inside this container. So think of it as another layer of containers. And this is actually how GitLab or Jenkins works. When it spawns up a job, it actually runs it in a container, builds everything, and then pushes it off. And that's really how lots of services running. It's all how serverless runs, but that's a different topic. So the context, you can then see the different contexts here, and you can right click on any of these contexts and say use, and then it actually switches the context to the other host, and then your whole interface changes. So you see all the containers from this host, you see all the images, registries, networks. So everything is as if you're logged into that machine. Well, you are logged into that machine with SSH or however you connect, but Visual Studio Code, you bring all your tools with you to that machine, which is really the brilliant part. So we're going to see that in the lab. We're going to head over to the lab, and you can see lab Docker context. We're going to define a Docker context. We're going to deploy a Docker and Docker container, and then we're going to launch containers within this container, and we're going to switch context between our local machine to the Docker and Docker machine and see where actually the differences are. So join me in the lab in the next section.